Welcome, folks. It is episode 136 of Two Chaps, Many Cultures on a wonderful Monday, Martin Luther King Day. Happy Martin Luther King Day. Is that a thing? Happy Martin Luther King Day? I don't know, but it is a wonderful celebration of a great life, a great man, in fact, which leads us into this topic of what does it mean to be a man? What culturally embeds the coding into what makes up a man in each culture? We're going to dig into that today. And yes, you will notice in the background we are dancing, and that's probably not a very manly thing to do, is it?
What a man, what a man, what a man, what a mighty good man. Mighty good man.
Singing may not be in our forte either. Welcome.
Not mine, at least. I know you have a trained voice, and is it manly of me to sing anyway? I don't know.
I think so. I just happen to think so. It might be the style of singing. Anyway, let's get into it. It is the show about the business of culture and the culture of business, and there is no bigger business than the culture of manhood, right? Virulent manhood. And what it means for different cultures, right? Yeah.
Well, are you a real man?
Oh, I don't know. I'm a man. To me, I identify as a man. To me, I'm real. I'm real flesh and blood. I am a figment of my own imagination. That's another story altogether. But yes, I guess the coded idea of what is a man has been passed on to me by my culture. It is handed down, as it is in all cultures. That's what culture is. It is people like us doing things like this. And so the idea of a man has been measured by people that do this wonderful work of intercultural in the intercultural field. None other than the great Höferle, who kind of coined a masculine, feminine dimension in amongst the many that he did. And one of the few, actually, I think he identifies one of the only dimensions that I'm going to go. I forget how he described it, but it's set apart from the rest of the dimensions. So it is a measurement that we use to think about not just men and women. It's not identifying men and women. It's identifying masculine and feminine and measuring a society as feminine or masculine, which is the way it measured in this case. Yeah. Which
is, I think, a loaded definition, at least looking at it from today's perspective. Maybe when Höferle defined those dimensions in the 70s and 80s, that was a different ballgame. In my opinion, the terminology didn't age very well, and I think even those who are in charge of stewarding the Höferle legacy and his research and work have hence developed a new terminology around that dimension, and I'm not 100% certain how exactly they reframed it, but in the intercultural world, the echo is still resonating of that terminology. It's cultures tend to be masculine or feminine based on gender role models that are quite old. Let's put it that way. I want to say overcome, but that are not necessarily true for gender role models today. Now, what makes a gender role model may very well be heavily influenced by the societies in which we live and operate and have our gendered experience, right? So what's the narrative that you were told about being a man when you grew up? What was it? What was the story you were told? What makes you a man in your memory?
Well, I think that I grew up in a very let me think about it in terms of the upbringing of mine was essentially blue collar. So it was the man goes to work. It was sort of tied to that. The man goes to work, the woman stays at home, cooks, cleans, and looks after the kids. That was pretty much the way that I grew up, and it was how it was messaged to me. Now, I say I have the good, it's like being a third culture kid without actually having the travel to go along with it. Having parents that actually divorced in the very early stages, I've said this before in this show, I do, when you've got two parents that separate, you're actually going across two different cultures in that case. So I think the way that, say, my mother might have expressed and embedded whatever the feminine side of me is, and that might have been to be creative and that kind of thing, was juxtaposed to going and then spending time with the other side of the family, which was more of that traditional, the man is the man and you have to be tough and you have to, build houses and all this kind of stuff. So it was, I think of that personally, it's a personal experience, not just talk about me, but that's a personal experience that I had the advantage of growing up and watching that, and now being able to explore what that's done to me, and maybe think about how does that impact other people that go through a multicultural type of experience.
And I want to pick up on that blue collar role model definition that you mentioned. I too come from a family that is not academically educated. I'm not sure if blue collar is a catch-all term for that. I'm fuzzy about that, but my narrative is I come from an entrepreneurial family that has no academic background. They're positively working class in that regard, but they were business owners. My parents owned a small business in retail, and interestingly enough, these role models of man equals competitiveness, assertiveness, also final decision maker in the household or in the business, almost like a pecking order hierarchy of the genders and generations. That was very much true for my upbringing as well. And as a teenager or even preteen, I began seeing those patterns and seeing the contradictions in it, because we owned a family business. Sure, my father was the nominal head of the household. However, my mom was working in that business as well, and so was my dad's mom. So he was surrounded by two female family members in the business who worked the same hours, if not more, than my dad. So I began, as a young kid, I began questioning this. So how come you get to call all the shots, but mom and grandma, they're doing a lot of work too, maybe more. So how do you, from what do you derive this authority? Not that I would have said that in those terms, but my adolescent mind had a hard time comprehending this, and the whole I'm the tough guy, and you need to toughen up, the whole thing. I grew up with that as well. They put me on the soccer pitch and I failed. I was a horrible soccer player. And I remember to this day my dad picking me up from soccer practice. The one time that he actually took part in a pastime activity of mine, and seeing my dismal failure on the grass. And I don't remember what he said, if he said anything at all, but his whole body language, his whole demeanor signaled to me his disappointment in his firstborn's failure at performing at the national pastime. And I struggled with that. I struggled with I think in American English, there's a terminology for this. I struggled with the jockiness, or the expectation of being a jock, J-O-C-K, of being an alpha male, dominant, athletic, assertive, competitive, if need be, punch you in the nose type of character. That was never me. And growing up as a teenager, as a prepubescent man, I struggled with that role. What does it mean to be a real man? Where does that start? Do I need to wait till I have facial hair? What does that mean? It's been a riddle to me all along. I don't know.
Well, here's a lesson in relativism, right? It is the sheer fact that I actually played football in the terms that I call football. That was the disappointment, I think, from my dad, you know, in terms of that rugby is the game. Rugby is the game. Rugby is the tough game in Australia, and he was a successful player at it. You know, played at a pretty good level and was great at it. And I grew up watching him do it. I loved the sport, but I just happened to have a passion for soccer, which I went down, right? So the relative is that I was actually kind of treated, you know, maybe as a outsider because I played soccer, for goodness sake, instead of rugby. It didn't take on. That was a less male sport, and yet it was just as tough as rugby, you know, especially at the level we played. And I want to get back to the point about, it's interesting that you talked about education and again, not to put big people in a big bin right here, but and stereotype, but there is Hofstadter talked about the relationship between functional illiteracy and a masculine society, right? A higher degree of functional illiteracy. And he even brought it forward even later in his life. He obviously, you know, watched social media, and he talks about, you know, I've watched videos and writings of his where he says social media is used differently in what we call masculine societies. They're used in masculine societies, it's more to gather facts. And that doesn't matter whether those facts are real or imagined, right? It is a place to gather facts and impose and kind of gather knowledge. And then, of course, you become the expert, even though you might have functional illiteracy. And we can talk about the levels of illiteracy, reading and writing, or, you know, college education. That's a vast spectrum. But in the other more feminine societies, social media has been used more as a real tool. I guess what the initial thought about social media would be, it would connect people. It would be a way of kind of making the group feel collectively belonging to something. So, you know, yes, I mean, I think it is maybe old-fashioned, but there is some relative or some connectedness to some of those societies today. And, you know, Germany was always kind of called a masculine society, right?
Well, I think those are cultural phenomena that can shift maybe more easy than other dimensions, in my experience. Because if you look particularly at German society, at German culture today in the 21st century, excuse me, math, not math. So, don't do math in public, Christian. So 21st century German culture is significantly different from German culture 100 years past. Right? So 100 years ago, we had a first attempt in Germany at democracy after losing World War I, emperor stepping down, making way for a new form of government, and it was still a very strongly hierarchical society with a dominant masculine strain, meaning that we want to win, we want to accomplish, we want to lead, we feel ourselves qualified to be a leading force, not only within our own country, but on a continental scale. You fast forward 100 years, and the sense of masculinity in Germany has changed. I'm not saying it's done a full 180, and I would not say that there is one masculinity narrative in Germany that we would agree on. There, I think, multiple different ones, and it depends again on literacy levels or educational levels, but also on the individual story background, right? Germany has become a much more diverse society, as have many other European and global societies have become more diverse over the last 50 years. And what is a rewarded masculine trait for some segments of society may not be the same for another segment of society. Especially if we look in Germany at refugee groups, or if we're looking at immigrant pockets that define masculine traits differently than the more established parts of society. And the same could be said of North America, the same could be said of many European societies, even Latin American societies, where the levels of what is machismo, or what is accepted, varies dependent on socioeconomics, ethnicity, and educational backgrounds, right?
Yeah. No. So would it be said? I know this is a question for you. Well, let's question and answer. So what is the most sustainable out of each of those dimensions? What do you think is if Germany has gone through that I mean, cataclysmic change in over 2 wars and kind of has transformed into a very now stable country with, as you say, all those characteristics, then you see countries that are now, we've gone through that in the States. We've gone through a very high. There's a great degree of blaming poor people for their own laziness. These kind of things that championing illiteracy, right, and diminishing anyone who's got any type of intelligence or facts, and we're not. This is not a political discussion. It's just an observation of what happens and what is history repeating itself. So, and then if you look at countries that have got big histories like China, and you see oftentimes that through the millennia of Chinese imperialism, and you see emperors that have become too big for their boots. And China is identified as a feminine country, but once an emperor becomes too big for their boots, they don't seem to last very long, and it's kind of, so there is this, do you see more future for a Germany that's in this situation than back in the times of where there was machismo was celebrated in the way that we're seeing it today in the US?
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this question the right way. I think every country has its, or every culture more specifically has its prototypical characteristics for a good reason, because that's how societies evolve and move on, and how they grow, I would say. And US culture, if there is such a thing as US culture, because it's not a homogenous thing, but if we look at US society as a whole, it's a young culture. It's less than 400 years old. Compare that to, as you said, China or Japan or many of the European cultures, that is still prepubescent age, right? And I would think the masculinity levels observed by themselves are not going to give us a full picture. And I think Höferle never meant that to be. I think he always meant to look at cultures through all these lenses and through all these aspects. But I do recognize this as an immigrant to the United States, that North American ideas of what it is to be a real man differ from the way I was told or I experienced. And it began, I think it was 17 when I first came to the US. The whole dating game, this teenage first romance, getting together or not, and how do you go about it? For me, this was terribly difficult in the United States, because I was not used to the level of assertiveness and straightforwardness that was expected of me as a man in that quote unquote dating game. Whereas I know a lot of Americans who came to the US, to Germany or to other European countries, where they stayed for a longer period as available, socially, sexually available individuals, and struggled with the dating game because they were expecting it to be the same at home, and it wasn't. So I grew up with an image of masculinity that is quite respective of female leadership and is respecting of equal rights. I was raised not only by my parents, but also by a set of 2 grandmothers who lived through World War II and who lived through the aftermath of World War II, and where there was a scarcity of men because they were either killed or missing in action or prisoners of war. And it was women who rebuilt Germany in the late 40s and early 50s. So in German society, there is a high regard for these, what we call rubble, the women of the rubble, who rebuilt the country from the rubble of the war. So there is no talking down to women. There is no disrespecting women for their labor. That just doesn't happen, right? So for me, this somewhat condescending masculinity that I sometimes experience in the United States goes against everything in my value set. Right? So if I'm looking at this today, I mean, we're looking at, I mean, today is January 18th. We're almost 2 weeks past the failed attempt at a coup in Washington, D.C. We saw American masculinity at play, a certain strain of American masculinity. I'm not saying all men in the US are like this, but this was the level of masculinity that is applauded by many in the United States. This, I feel that I have a certain right or that my position needs to be heard, so I take force in order to get what is mine or to have my right be acknowledged. And you may have also noticed that it was predominantly white men with that approach. So this robbed me to think, well, what are these men? How do these men justify these behaviors? What makes them think that this is an applaudable or a rewardable behavior? Because they think they're doing the right thing. I don't even want to make them wrong, right? This is how they see themselves. I don't see myself that way, so I was thinking, maybe it's just a different idea of what masculinity, manhood ought to be, right?
Yeah, and I'd certainly can't identify with it, but I'm still asking the questions. What is it? I mean, it's certainly, as you say, they certainly believe in that right, and you know, it's a visceral. We're not far away from it, so it's still a visceral feeling, and it's a visceral negative feeling for me. So I'm trying to maybe distance myself a little bit from it so I can look back and understand it. I mean, I think I know what's at the root of it, but I don't want to be accusatory. I want to say, well, I understand. These are people that perhaps from, their even equality is emasculating for them. You know, the thought of equality and being in an equal society is something that's taking something away from them. And so they've had nothing, they've really not lost anything in the past. I mean, you know, people are individuals, they certainly have gone through tough times, but they haven't lost anything in the past, and they're now looking to say, hey, you know, we want to tell people we've lost something, even if we have to make it up. That kind of, you know, and it seems condescending when I say that, but that's kind of how I see the messaging in this railing against and pretending that something has been taken away from them, especially when you've got a leader that they're following blindly that says, yes, you've had something to take. That kind of characteristic is affirming at the highest levels that they're right. So,
well, I don't want to state the obvious, and yet I will. But if a leadership person goes unpunished by publicly acknowledging to a term that he grabbed the women by their private parts, and if that is something that is applauded or even, well, and let's just say even only condoned, that gives enough credence to that level of masculinity that diminishes the female side of society, right? Look at me, I'm not wearing a black or white and blue patterned shirt. I deliberately chose my floral patterns for today because it's sunny, as you can see. I'm still catching some afternoon rays. I've been getting comments from Real Man about my pink shirts that I've been wearing. Oh, I got a great story for you. I may have told this before in a different context, but this fits right in here. As a young father in the United States, in the Tennessee Valley, mind you, in an area that is A, very religious, and B, still quite old-fashioned in terms of gender role or the understanding of such, I was asked to be a soccer coach for the youth soccer group. Because, hey, he's German, he's got to know his soccer. Did I tell you at the beginning of the episode how lousy I was as a player? But hey, you're German, you must be good at that. All right, so I volunteered, I did this quite successfully, I might say. And my wife tells me the story because she never was involved in any of this, except for one time when she had time and popped up her lawn chair on the soccer field, and where all the other soccer moms were sitting, and she was listening to the conversations, these moms who did not know that my wife who was sitting behind them was my wife. They were talking about me. and my wife overheard these soccer moms talk about me. And she overheard snippets of sentences like, "You think he's gay?" "Oh, no, I don't think he's gay. I think he's, what do you call this? I think he's metrosexual." "Oh, and have you seen him around town wearing his scarf?" So, and these were just the snippets of the conversation. So even for these women, my public appearance was taking or questioning my manhood, or that these women were not really sure how to position me within their greater societal context. Not that they would have these conversations at that kind of cerebral level, but this is what became apparent. And I when my wife told me that story, I thought, okay, this is actually fun. So metrosexual, me, oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what makes a society accept the fact that a guy needs to be tough and maybe settle disputes in a rough or sometimes even violent way that goes accepted, that will be condoned. Maybe there's going to be a little bit, you go to the headmaster and you'll sit this next one out, but deep down everybody's, hey, well done, kiddo, and you fought for what's yours, right? So that is somehow accepted as masculine behavior. However, if a man wears floral pattern, goes to knitting class, and likes ballet dancing, that would make the man less of a man, apparently. So whenever we put feminine attributes on a man in this context, it is seen as putting the man down a notch, as disqualifying that person from quote unquote real manhood, right? On the flip side, though, if a woman dresses like a man in business with a pantsuit, right, or if a woman displays assertiveness or has short hair like my wife does, then she's seen as, oh, this is a tough cookie, this is a tough lady, oh, they're professional, right? So whenever supposed male attributes can be attached to a woman that would actually amplify her level, that is seen as something positive, right? And then if a man talks about his, I don't know, sexual accomplishments or romantic accomplishments and even brags about it, there you go. Well done, man, right? You're spreading your seed, right? But if a woman talks about it in her terms, she will be called all sorts of things, none of which will be celebratory, most of which will be very judgmental and putting you down. So two different levels of measurement and two types of scales, I would argue.
Yeah. And what you're describing there is what Hofstadter says, one is a subject, one is the object. There is an objectivity, right? And there's a great show that my wife actually introduced me last night, is Emily in Paris. I don't know what this is a series. It's a short series apparently, but she was saying that, well, you do culture. Tell me what you think of this show. It has a lot of stereotypes. It is a little bit cringeworthy. But at its core, it does describe some of these differences about what men are perceived at, what women are perceived at, goes into different styles of communication and all that kind of stuff. So somebody in that show has maybe done a little bit of homework and probably over, just like all, creativity pursuits, it over accentuates the message a little bit. But it was through this young woman turning up in Paris and dressing a certain way, and then making the comment to her female, I can't pull off this lounging sexiness that you have, right? This kind of unkept but very stylish type of laid back type of I'm always available type of persona that she's put out. And this young girl who's come from America, putting that I have to be strong and I have to be powerful, I'm dressing that way to do that, right? So it is a good demonstration of, even between women, showing a male type of what that person would be growing up in the male-dominated structure of the business world here. Even in the creative world, right? There's that sense of power, and messaging has to be powerful and strong. And so It's just a good show. I would recommend people to go and watch it, at least the first couple of episodes. Cringe your way through it, because it is a little bit cringy. But I think just an interesting, like, and then I thought that it was funny. One of my clients once saying, after they spent 6 years in Switzerland, coming back to the US and saying, well, now I'm going to have to throw all my skinny jeans away. And I thought to myself, well, that's an interesting thing to say. Well, you explored it a bit. And I said, why do you do that? Oh, well, it's because nobody wears it here. Well, deep down, is it just because nobody wears those here, or is it because of the comments you're going to attract? Like you've got the comments at the soccer field, right? Yeah, people are going to notice you. You're going to stand out as somebody who kind of has a little bit more of a style, or a different style, not a style, but a different style. And it stands out. So therefore, all those wonderful clothes that you've invested in on your expat assignment are going to go to waste. You're going to, So I just think this is it's just a fun topic. It's what makes a man, what makes a woman. I think is an interesting topic. Yeah.
Well, and I do not want to shortcut the extent to which I think, in my opinion, a wrong sense of masculinity, how that can do harm to a culture, a group of people, and that's where I draw the line. Quite honestly, I mean, aside from the cultural definitions of these terms, I think a lot of what we are experiencing with the terminology called toxic masculinity or noxious or whatever ill-meaning masculinity, however you want to basket it. I don't want to preempt that, but a lot of it in my experience has to do, and this is something that I learned with age, because now I don't feel like I have to prove anything to my fellow men or the same way I did when I was 25, right? But looking back at myself, trying to be a real man, and how I either succeeded or failed by my own standards, or were my standards, more rather the standards that society portrayed to me. So I think a lot of that toxic masculinity is most often displayed by men who failed at modeling those wrong male narratives. So some asshole man in their lives have told them a real man's got to be like this, and then they fail at becoming that, and then they get angry with themselves and lash out at the world. I think that I'm oversimplifying, and I'm not a psychologist, but a lot of what I've seen in forms of toxic masculinity, both in my personal circles and in the greater scheme of U.S. society and European societies as well, is men not dealing very well with the fact that women have accomplished the same or more than they will ever accomplish themselves. And there are a few societies, both present and in history around the world, where we see more matriarchal society, where women are the leaders. We've seen a lot of that in Native American cultures. We've seen a lot of that in sub-Saharan African cultures, some Asian cultures as well. And they have seemed to fare very well for a long time. I'm not saying female leadership is per se better than male leadership. However, if you look at these cultures and societies today that have a history of matriarchy, their gender balance can be a bit different. And if you look at countries, national entities of today that have currently female leadership or had a longer period of female leadership, New Zealand comes to mind, Finland comes to mind, Germany, present-day Germany comes to mind, one of the Baltics. I'm sure there's a few others. Taiwan. Noteworthy. Female leadership seems to be a lot less aggressive, a lot less headline seeking, a lot less, hey, look at me, how great and competitive I am. It appears to me they simply get the job done. That may be one of the reasons why men who subscribe to a toxic level of masculinity struggle with that, because it's so effortlessly successful. And here you are, you alpha male, and you've tried so hard all your life to accomplish the wrong idea of masculinity all your life that some idiot men in your life portrayed to you, and you tried all you wanted and never reached that level, and there they are, the women being successful, and it doesn't even look like they've been trying. And what did you do? You stormed the Capitol. Good on you.
That's right. That's right. With your, well, it's mediocrity. You know, it's a mediocre way to lead your life. And I'm not saying that, you know, my history is perfect. I mean, I think my learning came moving countries, understanding, you know, when you go through an experience of crossing a culture, as we've always talked about, it is a lesson in looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing who you are and what you represent and what has been embedded in you from your earliest upbringing. And so that can happen, obviously, cultural dimensions, but it's also happening very confronting personally, right? So, and I think it affects, you know, we can talk about this all day, but I think it affects the people you attract in your life too, right? It also, if you change that mindset, if you change that or remove that toxicity out of your life, you open up yourself to more people that are going to be more open to you, right? And I think for me personally, that's why I married the wonderful, strong, accomplished, and not threateningly accomplished woman in my life, right? It's not where you're a true partnership. I know you have that joy in your life too, right? So we should have found that years ago. you know, it's been 17 years we've been married as well. So, but before that, I mean. So anyway, we're going beyond our time, I guess. So I thought that was going to be a short one. But this is fun. This is fun to explore, and we want to hear what you think. If you're watching the replay, send us your comments on what your upbringing taught you about masculinity. What was the ideal man in your culture, in your society? Did you live up to it? Do you think you failed at it? And are you comfortable with that failure? These are the many questions we pose on this show of Two Chaps, Many Cultures. And this is episode 136. Very proud of that. We're rattling along, really getting on to 150. It's getting there.
What a manly accomplishment that is, man.
Yeah, we are real men. Absolutely. So
thank you for this one, my male friend. Gosh, I don't want to make fun of this, right? And this is, and those of you who've been working in gender studies who are much more eloquent than either of us are on this topic, I'm sure you're going to find fault in the way we approach this topic. That's why we make this an open forum, educate us, because we're just some cis hetero white males who don't know any better, and have had a revelation about our own masculinity just fairly recently. So, but I think it's a topic worth indulging a little more, and not just on this one episode.
Absolutely. Thanks, folks. Two Chaps, Many Cultures. See you tomorrow.